Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Today on Afternoon Light, I am talking to Peter Drysdale, who is Emeritus Professor of Economics and the head of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research and East Asia Forum at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Peter.
Thanks, Georgina. It's nice to be with you.
Oh, great to have you on. And today I wanted to talk, well, you've had a fantastically rich and lengthy career, so there's lots of things to talk about, but I did want to start our discussion with a talk about Japan, which is where you started your career as an academic, as a very young undergraduate is it the late 1950s, early 60s?
Late 1950s, I'm afraid, yes.
Yeah. I mean, what a fascinating time to be studying Japan at a time when Australia really had a very different view from Japan than it does today.
Yes, it wasn't the career that most people recommended that I should join at that time. I mean, there's a great suspicion of Japan still, and the bitterness after the Second World War was very deep. So it was a pretty unusual thing as a boy to commit to working on Japan, and that's a long story. But the fact of the matter is that Crawford recruited me into the graduate program when it was being set up in the Research School of Pacific Studies. It was then known at the ANU, and that's where it all started. And I worked with Crawford in the last 25 years of his career.
And this was Sir John Crawford, who became the Secretary of the Department of Trade.
Yes, he was Secretary of the Department of Trade and quite a young fellow, but a leading light in the reconstruction and post-war economic and border policy strategies, diplomatic strategies of Australia after the war.
And Peter, what led you to an interest in Japan in the late 50s?
It began before then, Georgina. I was born before the Second World War. I grew up knowing about the Second World War. I was in Sydney when the Japanese submariners blew up the Caravel and tried to attack the American fleet there. So it was a big thing in my mind. My cousin was in Changi prisoner of war camp, and I had an aunt whose husband was killed, not in the Pacific, but in Bardia. The first thing she did was take on an Italian prisoner of war who were allowed to be released and help with the war effort then. That was a pretty significant thing. So that was the atmosphere and feeling in my life, whilst all this bitterness about the enemy persisted. For some time, I was fascinated by the possibilities of getting to know what the enemy were really like in East Asia. And at every point in my school career, committed to things to do with Japan. And you couldn't do very much of it in those days, I must say. But I did it in my history and economics work, and I ended up, when the agreement was signed in 1957 that normalized economic relations between Australia and Japan, doing an essay on that, and that led to my graduate work on the Australia-Japan relationship and its past and present and future.
And Peter, obviously Robert Menzies was Prime Minister of Australia at the time, and did you get a sense that he took a great interest in Japan? He really had to overcome quite significant domestic opposition to deepening Australia's relationship with Japan and, of course, then signing the deal in 1957.
He had a clear strategic view of the development of the relationship with Japan, supported and by his trade minister, McEwen, of course, importantly, and he had a close advice and working relationship that developed between Crawford, McEwen and Menzies was critical to taking the Australia-Japan Agreement on Commerce forward when it was a difficult thing to do politically. Menzies copped quite a lot of political flack in that process, particularly the labour-intensive manufacturing sector in Australia. The old Australian Chamber of Manufacturers was very hostile to the agreement and vilified Menzies at every opportunity, in some private meetings, I believe, quite uncivilly. And so it was difficult to take that forward. And the opposition at the time opposed the agreement in Parliament. Whitlam, who later became leader of the Labor Party, was quite ashamed of that and made a firm commitment to redress that when eventually the Labor Party came to power. But Menzies carried that through and was quite firm and resolute in his support for McEwen, and McEwen could rely on Menzies totally in the efforts he did to negotiate the agreement that we negotiated with Japan.
What was your sense of the attitude in Japan to this agreement with Australia? Was there concerns? Were the Japanese quite sort of enthusiastic about it?
Well, it was a very important agreement for Japan. I mean, the context here is interesting and important to understand. This is the context in which, in the post-war period, the whole global economic system was being remade under the Bretton Woods arrangements, which the United States instigated. Another thing that's not well known is that the commitment to reconcile with Japan politically and economically was made between Australia and the United States in the middle of the Second World War. The wartime agreement pacts, which delivered the American fleet and military equipment, the equivalent of the Atlantic Charter and Lend-Lease arrangements to Australia in the Pacific, which was signed, I think, in September 1942, also had Australia agree to commit to a multilateral system that would be set up after the Second World War, incorporating both victor and vanquished alike. And that was a big political change for Australia. It meant moving away from the old British imperial system to an open, multilateral, most favoured nation system in trade that treated everybody equally, including ultimately Japan. Now, under those arrangements, of course, the established powers, the victors, had the initial right to discriminate against Japan in trade under Article 35 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as it then was. The only country not to discriminate against Japan after the war immediately was the United States. But Australia was an important target in Japanese negotiators' eyes to change that regime. Australia became the second country, de facto, under the agreement of 1957, not to discriminate against Japan in its tariff and import control treatment. And so that was a very big diplomatic step and win for Japan. So there's a lot of interest in it. Now, what they thought about it is a different thing altogether, because the truth of the matter is that they were very sceptical that Australia would come to the party knowing a little bit about what Australians felt about the experience of the Second World War, the Pacific War in particular, prisoners of war, the Burma Railway, and all the rest of it. But in the end, Australia went into those negotiations with the clear aim of eventually effecting the transition whereby Japan would be treated as an equal partner in the international trading system. And that's what happened through the negotiations. In the 1957 agreement, there was de facto recognition of Japan as a most favoured nation partner. In 1963, that was made legal, in effect. We committed to it legally. So that was the big significance for Japan of the agreement. And that set in motion a whole process whereby other leading powers, United Kingdom, France and so on, in Europe, ended Article 35 treatment, which allowed discrimination against Japan. So it was a big thing. And it led to big concessions on the part of the Japanese for Australia in the negotiations, the most important of which at that time, of course, was to bind the tariff on wool imports, which were so important to Australia then, to zero. And that meant that Japan, as it recovered industrially, and its textile industry in particular expanded, included a hefty component of rising wool production and rising wool exports, an important source of demand for growing exports of wool from Australia. And at that time also, there was discrimination in the way in which Japan imported foodstuffs, discrimination in favour of the United States under its food aid plan in particular. And the beginnings of the breakdown of that discrimination in Japan's treatment of Australian imports started under the agreement on commerce between Australia and Japan too.
Peter, how important was the Cold War context to Australia's position on Japan and, of course, the United States? Was there a concern, I understand, that if Australia wasn't the exporting raw materials to Japan, particularly energy resources to Japan and minerals, that it might get import from communist countries like Russia and China, and then fall into the hands of the communists and be part of the sort of growth of international communism.
Yeah, so after the Allied occupation of Japan and the shift to Cold War status between the West and the United States and the Soviet Union, that became an important interest in Japan, but it really didn't dominate the rationale for the negotiation of the agreement on commerce with Japan. I think that was much more driven by important national commercial considerations, which saw Japan's recovery and potential growth as a very important new source of income, export income for Australia. And those interests were pretty uppermost in the minds of McEwen and his official advisors as they negotiated the agreement with Japan. This context was important more broadly in Australia's buying into the multilateral system too. In effect, what the removal of discrimination against Japan did lock Japan into further entrenchment in the multilateral system. And that was Japan's overarching objective then too. So it was really an important element in the Pacific in securing the international economic security dimension of the post-war settlement. The Americans and the Allies had organised more than anything else that Australia's partnership with Japan flourished within.
And in the development of the relationships, the Commerce Agreement, of course, but the relationship more broadly, what was the role of Sir John Crawford in all of this? You've spoken about Blackjack McEwen, of course, and Menzies, but the bureaucrats are incredibly important, as well as the academics, of course.
It was terribly important. If anyone was the intellectual architect of the post-war relationship with Japan, it was Crawford. I mean, there's some interesting history there, which is important to understand. Crawford, in 1933, when he was really very young, started to articulate the idea that Australia's future lay in the development of its relations with Asia, in particular Japan, China, the Netherlands, Indies, with Indonesia and so on in the future as their countries grasped industrialization and grew. In 1938, Crawford stood up at an Australian Institute of International Affairs meeting, presented a paper in which he said Singapore was a useful defense for Australia against Japan, and that we really needed to embrace a Pacific future and craft a pact with East Asia, which secured their economies through our resource supplies and secured our peace through political agreement with them. And that was a kind of contract which informed his thinking. I discovered this after I'd started to think through and work through the whole idea of Asia-Pacific economic cooperation and what that meant, because that's really what it meant. This guy had stood up as a 38-year-old, I guess he was then, and articulated all that in the face of the impending war with Japan.
Yeah.
And he carried those thoughts right through the war. And in the negotiations with the Americans over the wartime pacts, he was involved. He knew that at every point we had to come back to that reference point in our dealings with Japan. So when we signed the peace agreement with Japan in San Francisco, that was incorporated. Our commitment to ultimately most favored nation treatment was incorporated. And then when we moved to negotiate the agreement with Japan essentially after 56, Korf had to do all sorts of things to open those negotiations. He lived near the Japanese ambassador at the time in Canberra, and I used to play tennis next door, and he lobbed a tennis ball over the Japanese ambassador's fence so that he could go in and have a quiet and secret talk with the Japanese ambassador about opening negotiations. This sort of stuff went on in Canberra in those days. And that's how the negotiations got kicked off. So he was not inactive in this whole process, and he worked cheek by jowl with McEwen, and McEwen was right on side supporting all this and taking it forward and seeing the significance of it. He and then Westerman later in the 63 agreement did all the hard work. I got to say, when they actually had the negotiations down here in Canberra, the first Japanese lead negotiators came down. Ushiba, very famous Japanese diplomat, came down. And the Japanese were so surprised by the forwardness in taking this thing up of the Australians that they sent a message back saying that the Australians looked like conceding most favoured nation treatment. And the Japanese foreign ministry said, you better come back home. The water's got to you down there in Canberra. This can't be right. They didn't believe that this was going to happen. So it was quite an interesting period. But we were quite clear and purposeful, and Menzies stood by this with McEwen and Crawford taking this forward. And we had a strategy, and it was delivered through that agreement and the subsequent agreement. And of course, also the development of relationship with Japan step by step after that.
Peter, in the late 30s, when Sir John Crawford's standing up at an Australian Institute of International Affairs meeting with his Asia economic engagement plan, the sort of integration of Australia into these growing Asian economies, how radical was that at that time? Because the expectation at that time is that Australia's preferential arrangements with Britain would remain in place. European Union, European Economic Community didn't exist then. That sort of sense that Britain would just turn its back on its Commonwealth countries in terms of an economic relationship wouldn't have been contemplated. The United States, of course, was growing, but it wasn't the huge economic partner it then became. That must have been quite a radical thing for Sir John Crawford to suggest, especially as these Asian economies he's talking about were quite underdeveloped at that stage.
It was a radical idea, and it was a difficult idea to explain and to get right. And as you try to explain things that are new to people, how difficult this sometimes is, and especially in a context that's not necessarily receptive. So at that time, the idea didn't get automatic warm approval. There was quite a lot of dissent from it. At the same time, there were thinkers and forces in Australian society and the community who were receptive to it. I remember that there's a transcript of this meeting, or a semi-transcript of this meeting, and I remember some of the responses which were hostile, but some which were favourable too. The Boyer, the father of the Boyer, who was the ABC Boyer, graziers from Queensland, they were quite sympathetic to the idea that was being pushed forward. And that would have been a view that perhaps was not uncommon in the farming community, especially the grazing community across Australia at that time. So whilst it was a radical view, and it was an idea that could only be framed and conceived, 30, 40 years, 50 years later, it was an idea that resonated in thinking about the situation that Australia faced in its world. And Crawford, the title of Crawford's paper was Australia as a Pacific power. And so the conception of Australia joining the powers, the United States, in the future Japan and so on, play its role in securing the region was the fundamental idea there, securing the region through its openness to international trade, its deep engagement in international trade, and it's securing the countries that are inevitably going to be resource deficient in their development strategies. They had to rely on imports of raw material to develop and prosper. This was an idea that actually, of course, carried a lot of thinking forward subsequently, and it was at the heart of the process of setting up the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation arrangements in the 1980s.
Before we come to a discussion on APEC, which I am very keen to do, tell me, Peter, in your view, if Australia hadn't signed the Commerce Agreement in 57 and then the subsequent agreement in 63, what would have that meant for Japan in terms of its industrialisation? Would it have found another partner or? It
would have found other partners, but not other partners so well supplied with abundant and accessible and therefore relatively cheap raw materials so as to fuel its industrialization through its big industrialization drive in the 1960s and 70s. It became an incredibly efficient partnership and a very trusted partnership and reliable partnership. So it was central to Japan's successful industrial transformation in the post-war period. And it has, around the region, in subsequent years been similar in importance to the transformation of South Korea, Taiwan, China, and that's its role in the region. It's there are two things that matter in international perhaps three things that matter in international economics. I think, Georgina, the first is scale. As countries grow, they become more important to other countries. And so the commitment to growth and development in our region, first from Japan, is the thing that's been so important to Australia's security and prosperity. The second thing that matters is what I call complementarity, the structure of endowments, whether you're closely aligned in terms of resource endowments to have a very prosperous trade relationship. And of course, Australia is complementary to its partners in the region. Japan's the leading example of that. And then there's distance or closeness in all its forms, not only geographic distance, which is important in the shipment of raw materials in particular, but also, the time zone and the relative closeness that you can secure through agreements and partnerships such as the agreement on commerce and the subsequent agreements with Japan, the Agreement on Commerce Mark II, the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, the so-called Nara Agreement, and all that's come subsequently. So these three elements are what makes rational the hugely efficient economic relationship between Australia, Japan, and its other partners in East Asia. And they're fairly fundamental. They don't shift around dramatically unless you have a war. You see them break down then. But they don't shift around dramatically. They're the core rationale of Australia's economic and political engagement in Asia and the Pacific.
And so I wanted to now come to APEC, which you were obviously heavily involved in the development of in the 1980s, and Bob Hawke as Prime Minister of Australia, his government really led the charge in establishing the Asia-Pacific Economic Community and formulated, of course, many decades before as an idea by Sir John Crawford. How did you do this? This must have been monumentally difficult.
Well, again, it's a long story. The idea, of course, was cemented in my mind when I was a graduate student in Japan, and I saw up front how Japan was placed in the region and in the world, and how important its trade and economic relationships as Japan industrialized and developed had been around the region, and as they developed in the interwar period with Australia in particular, and what this meant to the concentration of interests in economic relations between the countries of Asia and the Pacific. So that's where my conception of it began, and working with my professors and mentors there and talking through these issues with policymakers there. I had an incredible access in Japan. I was only 28 or something when I first went there, pretty young. And, I was introduced to the captains of industry. I had an office in the foreign ministry. I had an office in the finance ministry. I had full reign over the new IBM 360 computer at the university at which I studied, Hikotsubashi University. I was like a little commodore. Yeah.
Which would have
pretty unusual.
It would have been the size of an entire room, I guess. Would have.
It was the size of an entire room. And that's where I did all my numbers. That brought many insights and brought a lot of support. The people that helped me, including, I'll tell you one story. Poirier, who was then president of the Bank of Tokyo, but the Bank of Tokyo is a special bank in Japan, and he had been involved as Japan's rep in the International Monetary Fund. And I had a meeting with him one day and talking about the development of Asia and the Pacific and so on. And as I was walking out, he patted me on the back and said, "Give my regards to Harold." And I thought, who's Harold? And then I realized it was Harold Holt, our then Prime Minister, that he wanted me to get to. I was busy. For some weeks after that, I was worried about how I was going to give his regards to Harold. Harold Holt, when I got back, we're going to manage it somehow. So that was the kind of milieu that I was in. There were only 35 graduate students in all of Japan then. Can you imagine it?
Amazing.
And I was one of two Australians there after the war. The other was Hal Bellacco, a Monash graduate who subsequently became professor of Japanese history at Harvard. And myself, he was at Tokyo University and I was at Hitotsubashi University. Those opportunities gave me a big insight into the way in which top people in Japan were thinking. And you inevitably became in later years members of study groups and so on. And in particular, the study group set up by later Prime Minister Ohira, who was actually a graduate of my old university in Japan and a big thinker, to think through the whole Asia-Pacific issue and economic cooperation and how that might be developed, was the big part of the engagement on that issue with Japan, and the partnership with Japan in delivering that was really very important. And we had infinite discussions around the region, workshops and so on from the 1970s through the 1980s, through the big so-called Pacific Community Seminar that Crawford organised. Fraser blessed and Ohira blessed here at the ANU, which laid out the framework for how we might manage economic cooperation in Asia and the Pacific and brought all the potential partners together, except one or two. China wasn't involved in that stage, although we did invite China and Taiwan to a public meeting. And then later, Crawford and I, and actually Ross Garno, went off to China in December 1980 to explain it all to the Chinese as well, and the Taiwanese separately. And they came on board in the informal process that was set up after that. It was a precursor to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative, the so-called Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, which the Pacific Community Seminar at the ANU was essentially deemed the first meeting of. So that process, it involved a lot of 1.5 track, second track diplomacy, never-ending meetings, persuasions, bringing thinkers in countries that were absolutely hostile to openness in trade, bringing them around to the view that it was in the interests of these countries, not immediately, but step by step over time, to open up their economies and prosper through international trade, as Japan had done and was doing, and as the region could do more fulsomely if they had a more open economic system. And those ideas gradually took hold and were entrenched in the APEC process itself when the APEC process got set up. but had been being entrenched in the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council process from essentially 1983 onward, before the APEC process got set up.
Which countries did you find were the most difficult to bring on board, Peter?
Well, I think in the event they were critical to this process, but Indonesia was, in a sense, the biggest challenge because it was the most important country to bring on board through the ASEAN process. The most difficult country, though, wasn't Indonesia and ASEAN, it was the Philippines, because the Philippines was fairly random in its diplomacy. And I remember one leading Filipino diplomat, Madame Del Mundo, her name was, and was really quite tried to tear the whole initiative down from the beginning. But they gradually came on board, and we had some highly strategic Filipinos involved in the process, like Cesar Barata, the former finance minister and prime minister in the Philippines, playing a leading role. So, step by step, all countries came to the party and saw the rationale and interests in cooperation among this group of countries. And with a face that positioned that cooperation with a global outlook, not a narrowly regional outlook, one that really saw the importance to that group of countries of the multilateral system, non-discrimination, and the gradual step-by-step progress of countries from different levels of development.
Peter, fast forward 40 years or 30, 40 years, obviously we are here today with a...
Not from now, I trust, Georgie.
Well, I'll speak to you in another few decades and we can see how things have gone. But today, 2022, the Asia-Pacific region, Indo-Pacific as some like to call it, now incredibly prosperous. I mean, really the engine room of the global economy. But we do have big geopolitical challenges with China. Australia has benefited hugely from a very prosperous relationship with China, supplying it mainly with raw materials. And, we've obviously in the last few years, met with some stumbling blocks, some trade embargoes against Australian exports to China because of various troubles in the relationship. How can good trade relations, a good rules-based order contribute to avoiding those geopolitical problems? Are there lessons we can learn from the early APEC days?
Yeah, that and also the architecture that was set up in the middle of the Second World War, the architecture that was translated in those wartime pacts between Australia and the United States, but were a reflection of the broader global initiative that the Allies took to establish the post-war international economic system there. They're the fundaments that allow this kind of relationship to be stable and develop in the way that it's developed in the post-war period, alongside the military security dimensions of that architecture. And the military security dimensions of that architecture weren't unimportant in opening up the relationship with Japan. It was the ANZUS agreement with the United States that gave us assurance that Japan would be kept in its box politically after the war and wouldn't pose a threat to us militarily if we opened up a significant economic relationship with it. And so these political arrangements are important to complement the economic agreements that secure openness in international trade and investment. So today, I keep encouraging return to that framework that the United States set up. Now, a part of our problems today, of course, are a consequence of the conflict or strategic competition, call it what you will, in the relationship between the United States and China, and how that spills over into our interests, political, military, and economically in the region. The big shock to our system really came with the trade war between the United States and China. Of course, there is a attendant issue of China's feeling politically more confident and building its security apparatus up in a way that felt uncomfortable, especially for the United States, and has to be dealt with. But the big shock really came through the Trump trade war, and the settlement there wasn't a settlement that was consistent with the rules-based system at all. Well, the settlement there was a settlement that gave the United States preferred treatment. This is a so-called phase one deal, which Biden has come back to, I might say, or at least USTR's tie has come back to. The settlement gave US exporters preferred treatment in the Chinese market and managed trade around that, basically, and third parties like us who are supplying some of these commodities to the Chinese markets to the devil, basically. There's no most favoured nation treatment here at all. So that's a big crack in the system. When the two biggest players in the system disregard its rules like that, you've got a problem. But of course, there are a lot of other countries that are heavily invested in its rules, including all the countries of Asia and the Pacific. So we have to push back and keep, as much as we can, the rules-based system, which of course in trade is centred on the WTO framework together. And that means reform of that system and carrying that forward and working with our partners who are similarly invested in it to take it forward and bringing the United States and China back into a partnership which respects that system also. That's not going to be easy. That's not going to be easy with the initiatives to decoupling both sides around now and with friendshoring and all that. But the truth of the matter is that the system's held up fairly well. And even as we were embargoed by the Chinese in our trade access to key commodities, there, barley and wheat and wine and so on, coal, what saved us in that situation was that we had the multilateral system working and we could ship those commodities, and not all of them, but most of them, off to other markets and compensate for the Chinese market through that process. That's the system that protects us. And we want China to come back to that system and walk back from using that weapon, because that's a threat to the system as well. And that needs to be made perfectly clear to China as we move forward in the relationship with China. But there's a lot of work to be done before we get to that point. But I think that's the strategic objective we need to pursue, to re-cement our region's interest, including China's interest in the multilateral system. Now, we made some progress on that this year, really, because the one thing we've managed to do in the face of all these uncertainties and difficulties in geopolitics and in the international trading system is negotiate the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China, which provides a base really for cooperation on cementing some of these principles down in our region in a way that will also support doing that in the multilateral system. We're going to have a ministerial and a leaders meeting at RCEP in November this year. That'll be an opportunity to see what the colour of people's money is as they bed that process down and seek to make RCEP an effective force also in strengthening the multilateral system.
Is there anything more Australia can do, though, to improve the state of play between, well, at least Australia and China, but we're also, as you say, affected by the arrangements between the US and China?
Well, I think there is a lot Australia can do and that we haven't yet done, frankly. I think the strategic importance of the RCEP agreement is probably underestimated. We've got the Chinese lining up to try to join the CPTPP, which is the arrangement that we hope the United States would join initially. And we've got to see what the colour of their money is, but there's every reason why we should engage, given that they've put themselves forward on this, and negotiate the hard issues in that, even if that takes a very long time, even if that game is a forever game, because that forever game is really at the forefront of the interests of the United States in getting a better deal out of China too. So I'm sure that the Chinese weren't unaware that trying to negotiate these issues through with Australia was going to be helpful to try to negotiate these issues through with the United States as well. So there are a couple of things we can do, but also we can be a more active partner with our countries in the region, including Indonesia, which surprisingly to some has been very active on WTO, international trade reform issues, and is almost certainly going to take that issue forward again, as it did in Osaka a couple of years ago, through the G20 meeting in Bali later this year too. So we need an active engagement with Indonesia and the parties that are party to trying to protect the WTO, the 17 members of the multi-party interim arbitration arrangement, which is a stopgap measure to have a dispute settlement process around the WTO, which has been blocked by the United States. So these actions are really important, and they're at the center of not only our economic diplomacies and its interests, but also at the center of securing us politically more broadly.
Some big challenges ahead, though, especially when you consider the domestic context for the major players. I mean, China, obviously, they have their own domestic issues, but the United States, where free trade is not such a popular idea as it once was, and in fact, there seems to be bipartisan opposition to trade liberalisation these days, which is very hard for a country like Australia that has lived and breathed trade liberalisation.
I think the one bit of good news out of the United States, Georgina, is that the US Congress is predisposed to do nothing now, and if they do nothing, at least they won't make things worse.
But some concluding remarks, Peter, about that eternal fight for trade liberalisation, because it's easy to make the case to protect your domestic markets, because people sort of intrinsically think, well, we should manufacture things here, we should have our own industries here, and why would we ruin, say, a car industry just to allow another country to benefit from having a car industry and selling their cars to us. But trade liberalisation it's a tough argument to make. The broader benefits are clear, but it always is a battle to be fought, isn't it, for policymakers and political leaders and diplomats, of course.
It is a huge battle, and it's a continuing one, and it's a more difficult one now in the circumstances we face today. Not only did we have the global financial crisis put pressure on openness to trade earlier on, and that's a good part of the story in the United States, backing away from an open trade strategy. But now we've had the COVID crisis and all the uncertainties about the security of supplies of various kinds, not only medical supplies around that. And then there's a geopolitical issue, and that's been exacerbated by the war in Europe, the Russian invasion of Ukraine now, with the application of sanctions on Russia and worries about how sanctions will be used in future and the security dimensions of trade. So all these things are now playing into the mix as forces against openness in international trade. But I must say that in Australia, given its economic and structure and its political system to some extent, the central interest of openness to trade, there'll be weaknesses and pushbacks in various ways, but the central interest in openness to trade, I think, are pretty well understood. That's fairly clear. And I think one of the big protections in keeping openness to international trade for countries like Australia is that you have an effective welfare system in effect, that compensates the inevitable losers there will be through openness to international trade effectively. It's not only a system that protects declining industries that are exposed to trade competition and stuff like that. It's a system that ensures that there are effective income transfers across households to support households that fall on bad times, not only through trade shocks, but through other shocks in the economic system. one of the things that you see in studies of politics and economics is that countries which have such systems in place are more disposed to positive thinking about open trade. The Scandinavian countries, Australia and New Zealand, fall into that camp. The United States doesn't, because it hasn't got that system in place. So this is a strength we have. We have a natural and powerful interest in trade, especially with our neighbours in the region. Over 2/3 of our trade is with them, both ways round. Protecting that, I think, is seen by the Australian community right across the board, by and large, as a fairly important strategic interest for Australia. And we've got some systems in place. We ought to make sure we husband them carefully and keep them in place carefully that protect us against shocks of various kinds, including trade shocks. And the system has worked fairly well. And we've got those systems include a flexible exchange rate system that taken us through massive trade changes, with big rises in our terms of trade and big falls in our terms of trade, and they're being distributed well across the community because we've got those systems in place. So we can't underestimate those systems and the value they have to making our economy and our polity work fairly well.
Well, that's a great note to finish on, Peter. Thank you so much for joining me on the Afternoon Light podcast today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I wish you all the very best for the next few decades in your fight for regional trade engagement, economic engagement and cooperation. Lots more challenges ahead of us, and hopefully some bright sparks too. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Georgina, and I see that you're still a great optimist.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.